Boa tarde a todos, boa tarde a todas. Obrigado pela presença, ainda que virtual, neste webinar da Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso, para discutir um tema que tem nos ocupado, que imagino a grande parte das pessoas que hoje nos assiste, que é procurar entender what's going on in the US, né? O que é o governo Trump, um governo que em pouco mais de um mês provocou mudanças e turbulências várias que afetam o conjunto do sistema internacional, tem repercussões sobre a América Latina, tem repercussões sobre o Brasil. Este é o nosso foco hoje. Evidentemente que nós vamos levar em consideração o panorama global, mas o nosso foco recai sobre a região, me refiro à América Latina, e em particular sobre o Brasil. E temos aqui três convidados altamente capacitados para nos ajudar a compreender esse momento delicado da vida internacional. Antes de apresentá-los, eu gostaria de pedir um minuto de atenção de todos vocês para o vídeo institucional da Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso. Eu gostei do jeito que ele ficou e ele tem outra vantagem, ele é bem curtinho. Então vamos lá, Benê.
Encarar desafios civilizatórios inéditos por meio do diálogo e da produção de conhecimento. Promover discussões de qualidade, abertas a diferentes perspectivas e pontos de vista. Ter capacidade de aperfeiçoar a democracia e superar a polarização destrutiva. Entender o papel do Brasil em um mundo de constantes transformações. Num dramático cenário de mudanças climáticas, ser parte da solução. Fazer bom uso da tecnologia para promover altos padrões de governança e um desenvolvimento sustentável e inclusivo. Conhecer o passado, entender o presente e projetar o futuro. Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso. Um legado em movimento.
Muito bem, aí está. Comentários são sempre muito bem-vindos. É um esforço nosso de dizer em poucas palavras e numa linguagem, enfim, simples, fácil, qual é o nosso propósito, o que somos e o que queremos. Muito bem. Não poderíamos ser nada se não tivéssemos o apoio de várias empresas e pessoas. Eu aqui me refiro exclusivamente às empresas que patrocinam o ciclo anual de seminários da Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso. Eu gostaria de agradecer a cada uma e a todas elas. Muito bem. Now I'm going to turn to English. I'm going to briefly introduce Ricardo, Nick, and Fernanda. I'm going to read it to avoid mistakes. Of course, you can add anything you want to your short bios. I'll start by Ricardo Zúñiga, who is a founding partner of Dinâmica Américas. Ricardo will explain what Dinâmica América is. It's a consultancy firm, but he is better equipped to explain what it is compared to me. He was a career member of the U.S. Senior Foreign Service, serving for 30 years in multiple roles, including as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, U.S. Special Envoy for the Northern Triangle that comprises Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and U.S. Consul General in São Paulo. He served as President Obama's Principal Advisor for the Americas from 2012 to 2015, during which time he worked closely with then Vice President Biden and advised cabinet members and other senior leaders on events in the Americas. Nick Zimmerman is also a founding partner of Dinâmica Américas. He served as White House National Security Council Director for Brazil and the Southern Cone Affairs, among other high-ranking positions he had in the U.S. government. Since 2017, Zimmerman has had leadership roles in several strategic advisory firms, counseling Fortune 500 companies, philanthropies, and civil society on U.S. politics and policy, as well as political, economic, and regulatory developments in the Americas. Last but not least, Fernanda Manhota, PhD, a prominent Brazilian professor and U.S. politics expert focusing on U.S., China, Latin American relations. Leading FAAP's International Relations Program in São Paulo, she is a senior fellow at SEBRE and contributes as a columnist for Portal UOL and CBN Radio. Her insights feature in other major media in Brazil and the US, such as CNN, Globo News, Estadão, Folha de São Paulo, and the New York Times. So thank you, the three of you, for making the time to be here with us today. The plan is each one of you will speak initially for 10 minutes, and then we're going to turn this into a conversation. The audience is allowed to ask questions through the chat. The questions will be selected, and to the extent possible, I will present them to the participants. So, Ricardo, the floor is yours.
Sergio, thank you so much for allowing us to be here, for inviting us to be here. So you mentioned that Nick and I are with Dinámica Américas. So we are four partners, Nick Zimmerman, Dan Restrepo, and Roberta Jacobson, our colleagues, and that all of us came from working in public service at some stage. Roberta and I were each in for over 30 years. Nick and Dan served in political positions during the Obama administration, and we also have a couple of additional advisors, including one that's very relevant for this conversation, whose name is Juan Cruz, who was, as Dan Restrepo and I advised President Obama, Juan Cruz, advised President Donald Trump in his first term as the senior advisor in the National Security Council for the Americas. So he's another person who's helped us kind of understand how this administration is really looking at these relationships, and that's part of our conversation. The firm is a strategic advisory firm. We help NGOs and private sector organizations kind of understand what's happening in the Americas, but also helping people in the Americas understand what's happening in Washington. And that's what this is about. So thanks so much for this opportunity. So let me just start off by saying, if you knew Washington as of the first week in January, it's a totally different place now. Washington is it's a completely different world. The flip in the United States on Ukraine at the UN and the vote this week, and with the fact that NATO is on life support, and the fact that there was almost no pushback from Congress or from prominent members of the president's own party on very long-held views about Russia and Vladimir Putin tells you that something has happened. But there are instances like that across government and across what we've seen so far in foreign policy as well. Now, I think it's best to understand it if you're not in Washington, or if you're not in the United States. I think the cleanest way to understand what's happening in the United States is it's kind of a revolutionary process. This is how they see themselves. They see themselves as in Washington to alter the country, to alter the way that the country operates, and to alter the way that government works. That's very much how they see themselves, as disruptors, but very serious disruptors in terms of institutionality as well. And they see that as a good thing. That is their purpose. Donald Trump as president is the unifying force of very different factions that are among these very different revolutionary groups. But I think it's really important to understand that. Another thing that's very important to understand is that the concentration of power in the White House, as opposed to in the agencies or among other parts of the U.S. government, is greater than any time we've seen since the 1930s. That's also altering very much how the interaction of how government is working and how Congress is dealing with that. Right now, there's no question that Trump's vision is absolutely dominant. He's getting loyal support from congressional Republicans. The Democrats have not figured out how to counter this on a political level. And the resistance really has been quite minimal in terms of pushing back. That doesn't mean that he's having everything his way, and we can talk a little bit more about that in the conversation. Certainly, there are great concerns about the economy and the general population, particularly when it comes to conversations around tariffs and other sort of potentially inflationary moves. But let's talk about foreign policy and policy in the Americas specifically. So I mentioned Juan Cruz had worked for President Trump as his senior advisor for the Americas at the National Security Council, and he has I think a really interesting insight that is important to for everyone who's looking at this from the outside, which is that Trump doesn't really have bilateral or regional policies. He has themes that he protects. He has themes that he advances and prioritizes. This is why the traditional U.S. alliance system really doesn't make any sense to Trump. Because from his perspective, every relationship is different and standalone. So what that means is that there are areas, and every country is sort of judged against those sets of priorities that he's interested in, and how they benefit his administration and the United States in particular. So the reason that that's important to really underscore is we're used to thinking about what's the relationship going to be like with Brazil, what's the relationship going to be like with Mexico and the United States, et cetera, and that's not really the main point of how Trump operates. And it also means that risks and opportunities are going to be geopolitical and not bilateral. So we can talk a little bit about that as well. In Latin America, what he's really most interested in is immigration, combating organized crime, and countering China's presence in the Americas. Those are the kind of the three main lenses. For North America is rather different because of the USMCA trade agreement, and Brazil is different as a BRICS member because he also has a perspective about how the BRICS interacts with the United States and sees them in a threatening way, and so Brazil's membership in the BRICS adds another layer. Now, we've seen that some countries in the region have done quite a good job of managing the relationship with the United States, and not just the obvious ones. I mean, I would say, frankly, right off the top, that Claudia Sheinbaum is the gold standard for how to deal with Donald Trump's Washington, and she protects her political prerogatives in Mexico and speaks to her audience while also having a workable relationship with President Trump, and a respectful one. And so she has managed that, frankly, better than almost any other international leader. And then we have a number of other countries where there's more ideological alignment. Argentina, obviously, El Salvador with President Bukele, but then a couple of countries like Guatemala and Honduras where there isn't ideological alignment, but they have aligned themselves with the administration on immigration policy very quickly, and they've seen a very stable and positive relationship for the most part. There are, as we said, different factions involved, and we've seen that play out in the Americas as well. I mean, today there's been some action around Venezuela with President Trump announcing kind of a rollback of certain benefits in that relationship and claiming that Venezuela has not been collaborative on immigration issues. But up until now, there's been a lot of tension between the groups that are arguing for an immigration-first relationship with Venezuela that prioritizes deportations, and one that's sort of more ideological and goes back to the total pressure campaign of the first Trump term. So that's yet to see, that's yet to play out, but that's an important one. Then we have other countries where things haven't gone as well. And Colombia is the best example. In a lot of ways, Petro was the first one out of the gate, testing the Trump administration on immigration policy, and frankly, walking into a punch. Because by turning off deportations within the first week of the administration on the grounds of that the prisoners are being transported in inhumane conditions on military flights, the Trump administration came back with threats of tariffs, with cutoffs of access to visas, in frankly very quickly, and within 24 hours, the Petro government had folded and had decided to basically, not fully accept the terms set by the Trump administration, but most of them, as related to deportations, and that was everyone in the region watched that. And so that's a government that kind of brought that initial conflict on itself. Then you have Panama, a country that clearly did not bring the issue of the Panama Canal onto itself. That was something that President Trump brought with him. And we know, again, from the President Trump's first term, that the issue of the canal is a deep-seated issue that goes beyond whether it has to do with China or whether it has to do with trying to lower the costs for it. He does not believe the canal should have been returned to Panama, and that colors every aspect of his approach to Panama. So one of the points, Sergio, that was raised in the among the prompts was, does President Trump bluff? He pushes as hard as he possibly can on an objective, and you absolutely have to consider that they would have considered taking physical control of the canal in some way. Absolutely possible they would have done that. So the issue here is that you do have cross-cutting tensions, and I think that's important. And so I'll just close with a couple of other observations here. One is that I mentioned immigration, counter narcotics, and China are the priorities for the administration. Well, there's real concern about whether cutting foreign aid in the way that this administration has done it is going to undermine each of those objectives. Because, for example, counter narcotics programs have also been frozen. Among all the other elements that have been suspended for the moment, those are some of the ones that are most important, and they are currently under suspense. On the issue of China, if you don't have foreign aid and you are not prioritizing free trade agreements, then you kind of create an opening for China. So the question is, how do is it going to all be strong arm tactics like what we've seen around the canal, or are there going to be incentives? And so it's possible that if the DFC really is turned into something like a sovereign wealth fund, as they're interested in doing, that you could have those incentives. Let me just close on a couple of quick points. One is for Brazil, and Nick was going to cover more on the relationship with Brazil, but how is Brazil going to operate in a world where Vladimir Putin has a better relationship with President Trump than he has with the president of Brazil? And that's a real sea change in terms of how Brazil has looked at the world. There's questions about whether the de facto suspension of the NATO alliance, or certainly the terms of that alliance, what is that going to mean for global security, and will that affect emerging markets? And what is that going to mean in terms of interest rates and other pressure points on emerging markets? And finally, and this just to really close, what if Trump and Xi and Putin just decide that they're going to divide the world among them into three spheres? What does that mean for the rest of the world? And the rest of the world has kind of built its future looking at the BRICS as the up and comers. What's the logic of the BRICS in that kind of a world? So let me end there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ricardo. You covered a lot of ground in just 10 minutes. We're going to go back to some of the interesting questions you've raised. Now, your turn, Nick.
Grato pelo convite, Sergio. As Ricardo alluded, I'm going to speak a little bit more on what does this all mean for Brazil. As Ricardo noted, we've seen in Scheinbaum in Mexico, Arevalo in Guatemala, Milei in Argentina, Chavez in Costa Rica, Bukele in El Salvador, a number of leaders in the region that have managed fairly well by delivering Trump political wins, as he likes to call it, whether in substantive terms or in marketing terms that Trump can use domestically as spin. And there are lessons in that for Brazil if it's interested. I think it's an open question how much of a priority that is for Lula in his last 2 years before re-election. And I'll say at the top that ultimately, I believe some sort of a collision between the two countries over the next 2 years is more likely than the development of a pragmatic, if somewhat distant, relationship. Of course, that's a story still to be told. Let's start with the good news. The good news is that, like Scheinbaum, and unlike Gustavo Petro, Lula has taken a measured tone when it comes to migration cooperation and U.S. deportation flights coming into Brazil. I think this is a clear recognition by him and his team that no matter how these flights may be perceived domestically by the Brazilian people, they understand that a public confrontation on that issue right now is not in Brazil's strategic or economic interest. And so as a result, it's still early, but Brazil has largely escaped the White House's radar on migration issues. That is a model, perhaps a template that can be followed. in comparison to Canada or China or the European Union and Mexico. Brazil is not as much in the commercial crosshairs of Trump's trade and tariff plans. That would be good news, point two. Of course, I'm fully cognizant that there will be negative repercussions for Brazil's economy should Trump implement aluminum and steel tariffs, for example, or move forward on his broader reciprocal tariffs plan. But I just want to stress that these policies are less specifically about Brazil and more about scoring global points generally. And importantly, they're also about generating revenue at home to pay for a massive tax cut. That's perhaps his number one legislative priority early on in his term. So not necessarily good news in the absolute for Brazil, but not being motivated by a specific bilateral dynamic there. And so that could create more space for Brazil to negotiate. So let's say, well, actually, not let's say, Sergio, the entire framing of this event is how much of this is real, how much of this is rhetoric, how much is Trump bluffing, so on and so forth. I totally understand using such a frame, but I don't really think about Trump in terms of bluffing per se. When it comes to tariffs, I see this much more about leverage and negotiations. So in a given instance, it could be a bluff, though his willingness to follow through could be real. What do I mean? What I mean is, dependent on the issues that are priorities for him, that Ricardo mapped out, he will ratchet up threats and ratchet them down as he sees fit. When he extracts concessions, as he did from Scheinbaum, for example, by sending 10,000 National Guard to the US-Mexico border, he will stand down, at least temporarily, on a threat for tariffs. I wouldn't say that that was necessarily a bluff. It was a tactic and to see what a response would be. How much negotiating space does he have bilaterally and multilaterally? This will be a constant theme throughout his presidency, frankly, with all countries with which he has put some attention to. Finally, in terms of the good news, there is an evolving, uncertain, but evolving policy discussion in Brazil about whether or not more can be done to federalize a response to transnational criminal organizations in Brazil, like the PCC. That could potentially open up new space for bilateral cooperation. We've seen other countries in the hemisphere and the world make pledges to work more closely on security issues and curry favor with Donald Trump. A brief example before going to the bad news. I'm not procrastinating, I promise. There's Republican and Democrat congressional interest in rooting out illegal mining in the Amazon and how that mining is financing criminal organizations. And there was a recent agreement, if I'm not mistaken, just last week between the State Department and the state of Rio de Janeiro to coordinate further on working against the Comando Vermelho. These are potential good news stories that could maintain a pragmatic cooperation in the relationship. That said, there's a fair amount of bad news out there too. The competition with China, as Ricardo alluded, is a huge motivating factor for the Trump world. And Brazil will spend much of 2025 very much at the forefront of this rivalry because it's going to host, of course, the next BRICS summit. This puts something of a bullseye on Brazil's back. And we've already seen some of this, right? I mean, Trump has talked publicly about how he intends to react quite strongly if the BRICS Plus coalition does move forward concretely with de-dollarization initiatives. He's talked about 100% tariffs. And this, of course, has long been a priority of Lula and advisors around him. So this is a space to watch with some concern. There's a very damaging, self-fulfilling prophecy at play in the relationship, I fear. And that is namely that Trump's transactional and frankly punitive approach to foreign policy is going to push Brasilia further into China's orbit. Beijing will understandably, from a Brazilian perspective, I think be increasingly perceived as the more reliable economic partner. and an obvious place for Brazilian exporters to turn to offset the damage that will be caused by Trump's tariffs. But this in turn will have a reaction in Washington, which will further raise Trump's ire and therefore push the United States, the administration rather, not the country, to consider not only additional economic retaliation, but also getting further involved in Brazil's 2026 presidential election, which will only add further toxicity and political polarization into the bilateral dynamic. And so 2026 and the Brazilian election represents a major risk. The embrace of big tech, of Trump, most exemplified by Elon Musk, who's working in the White House, will likely result in an increasingly intense US governmental effort to undermine the credibility of the Brazilian judiciary, particularly as the election gets closer. And as the Lula administration continues to make noise, continues to advocate for the need for legislation to regulate social media platforms, which these companies fear could become a global model that could affect their bottom line. There's a lot of potential tension points in there, right? And so we will likely see in the next 2 years, we're already beginning to see it, some of the world's most influential and powerful social media platforms supporting whoever becomes the opposition candidate to Lula or his successor, and ultimately flood, or at least facilitate in the digital world, political disinformation and misinformation regarding Brazilian elections, regarding the role of the Brazilian courts, that will perpetuate a victimization narrative that's already entrenched in certain elements of Brazil's farther right. And this is going to make normal, pragmatic cooperation, respect for sovereignty between the two countries rather challenging over the next 2 years. I'll conclude with this and put it in a slightly different way. The multipolar world, the famous multipolar world that Brazil has long hoped for, is not developing in the way, at least over the near to midterm, it's not developing in a way that's advantageous for Brazil's interest, because it is unlikely to enhance Brazil's strategic positioning as an emerging power or a global swing state. Instead, in the short term, over the next year to two, what seems more likely for Brazil is a disproportional dependence on China in an increasingly transactional world that shirks global norms and where Brazil's interests can be more easily sidelined. And so the multipolarity that's been long dreamed about and desired by Itamaraty, for example, it actually right now, today, seems more likely to create a new unipolar dependence for Brazil on China in ways that actually could dilute its broader influence, even while perhaps delivering some short-term economic gains. I'll stop there. Thank you again for the invite, Sergio.
All right, Nick, you touched a very sensitive, a critic point at the end of your presentation. We're going to go back to it in our conversation. Fernanda, now it's your turn. You can either speak in Portuguese or in English. It's up to you.
Okay, thank you, Sergio, so much for the invitation. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all at Fundação FHC. And it's a huge, huge pleasure to be with my good friends, Ricardo and Nick. It's a great opportunity to hear them. It's always very, important to learn by them. And I'll try to complement what they just said. I was trying to organize my ideas, and I was very inspired by the question that it was used to the communication of our event. What is real and what is rhetoric? And I think that the first point I would like to make is that, at least for my perspective, Trump's government, the second government, it's not just like Trump 1. Trump 2 is different from Trump 1. And I think that sometimes treating everything that Trump says just as a bluster is not the best approach to deal with what it really is. I completely agree to what Nick just said, because I think even if we consider the figures that Trump chose as historical references to identify himself in each moment, say a lot about the priorities in each of the moments he was governing. Trump 1 was very associated with the idea of Andrew Jackson, so the populist, the nationalist approach, and Trump 2, the Trump we're right now testifying, is very based on the idea Trump used himself in the inauguration speech, the idea of William McKinley, the idea of having back the Gilded Age, as it was very well documented at that time in the 19th century. So Trump 2, in my perspective, is a more relevant period in terms of ambition. Trump is more ambitious now than he was during the first term. And this Gilded Age, if we go back to history and recover what was this period, is a period in which the US had a very unprecedented industrial growth, the consolidation of US economic power, a very strong protectionism also, and also a very assertive foreign policy in terms of expansionism, even territorial expansionism at that time. So it was also a period in which we have alliances, very strong alliances between government and large corporations, and profound, very significant social transformation. So it's not a coincidence that Trump evokes the McKinley era. He is sometimes making sure that the policies he's trying to address somehow connects to this historical background that he is now trying to rebuild. He's using the expression Gilded Age. We're back to the Gilded Age. So this is not something that I would consider less relevant. What I see that remains from the first term is, of course, the nationalist appeal. It's still there. The short-term perspective, it's still there. The use of economic mechanisms as instruments of political bargaining, it's still there. And also, of course, the review of US commitments in terms of criticizing and trying to reshape the so-called liberal order. So this were all during the first term and are still there. But all of these, I think, comes with more audacity in this new government, especially because Trump is more experienced now and has greater domestic support at this moment, not just as Ricardo mentioned at Congress, but also because he was elected both by Electoral College and also the popular vote, because he has the most part of the votes in the Supreme Court, because he knows that probably inside the government he is surrounded by people that are very loyal to him. So he's much more ambitious right now. And this ambition comes with the idea that the most important thing is that he wants to keep the US in the offensive, the permanent offensive, and of course all the other countries in a position of a defensive position. So we're all testifying such tough negotiations going on, and also the idea of being very unstable sometimes is part of the bargaining that he's trying to implement, as he did in the first government. And also, I think what is very clear right now, more than it was in the first moment, it's the increase, the idea that the US should use as a strategy an approach that increased the return on the American investment. He's doing that all over the place. So it's true for Europe and Ukraine. It's true for Gaza, Israel, it's true for the Panama Canal, it's true for the tentative of buying part of the territory that is not part of the US right now, but he would like to be. It's part of approaching Canada as the 54th state of the US. It's part of everything that he's saying. I would say that it's not just rhetoric, because sometimes the strategy of chaos is part of a calculated way of making sure that you create an environment in which the traditional diplomatic approaches become ineffective. And sometimes the chaos is a tool of control. So it's part of the strategy. And I would say that sometimes in the foreign policy approach, there is also something that we, from the political science field, we learn as a theory that is called overtone window. It's a very popular and well-known theory in the political science literature. And the idea of this overtone window that Trump uses a lot is that sometimes you use as a strategy an approach that is intended to redefine the possible. And this is what I see that he's doing. So the theory refers to the range of ideas deemed politically acceptable to any given time or subject. And sometimes by introducing extreme positions or proposals, the boundaries of public discourse are effectively shifted. So the center appears to move, and ideas once considered radical sometimes start to seem reasonable. So I think what is happening right now for Trump in general and foreign policy in particular is part of what we saw in the first term, and is also part of this new and more audacious approach that is strategy of cost and manipulating the overtone window, trying to redefine the possible. And this is very, very relevant in terms of the major issues we have. I have some comments on Brazil also, but I'll let it for the Q&A session, because it's been a lot and my time is limited. Thank you.
Fernanda, thank you so much. I'll follow up on the very insightful remark you made about pushing on the limits, the boundaries of what is thinkable, what is normal, right? My question is, how far would Trump go in asserting US power in the region? Because I think it's one thing to raise tariffs as a leverage to negotiate. It's a completely different thing to take control of the Panama Canal, right? So my question to the three of you, but especially to Ricardo and Nick, is, of course, you don't have a crystal ball. Not everyone inside the administration is see eye to eye in this respect. But when you think about Trump, how far is he ready to interfere in other countries' sovereignty? Mexico, drug cartels, Panama Canal, regime change in Cuba. Your views on that?
So I think, one, he's quite willing to interfere in other countries' sovereignty. That's no constraint for him. In the case of Mexico, I would say the chances are probably going up of some kind of military strike against a cartel inside of Mexico. Frankly, at this point, I said Sheinbaum has learned how to manage that relationship. Our team, our group believes that she would actually be quite effective. Still, I mean, it would be a political crisis for any Mexican leader to have a foreign attack in Mexican territory. But in a sense, it's been priced in because Trump's team has been talking about it for so long. It seems almost inevitable that something will happen. When there was a discussion of there being drones already operating, President Sheinbaum made clear. She said, "Well, we that's part of our collaboration." You can imagine an attack taking place in Mexico. In the case of Panama, You don't have to see them taking physical control of the canal. If you have a U.S. military vessel simply approaching the canal and saying, well, we're going to pass through for free, the canal authority says, no, 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 you're not. It's actually not much money involved, but if they say, no, you're not, then you could easily see this U.S. naval vessel simply set itself in front of the canal. And who is going to move it? Is that he would be perfectly comfortable inviting an act like that, or inviting a government to respond to an act like that. It's real. So understand that it's all part, as Nick and Fernanda said, part of negotiation and part of escalation to achieve an end. But he will go as far as he possibly can with countries that can't retaliate. With countries that can retaliate, like Mexico and Canada and trade issues, he's going to be much more cautious.
Nick, you want to add something?
I think Ricardo largely covered it. I guess I would add, Sergio, just to tease the point out further for the sake of the audience. The examples that Ricardo gave are spot on, and it's hard for me to envision a scenario where he needs to go farther, but I think there's a limit out there in terms of military action in general. He's shown himself to be skittish about whole-scale regime change. I base this on his track record in the Middle East, for example, more comfortable with, discrete strikes. I'm not sure I see a realistic scenario in the Americas where he would be forced to decide upon a larger scale operation or standing down. But you never know what happens in the world. In that scenario, I think that you might actually see him be a bit squeamish and find an off ramp, like he did on some occasions in the Middle East during his first term. But again, I think those scenarios are not terribly likely to transpire.
Right. So you don't see mariners disembarking on the shores of the Gulf of Mexico, pardon me, the Gulf of America, and that sort of boots on the ground kind of.
Well, tease the point out, I suppose. Fair enough. I guess what I think is much more likely, and as Ricardo alluded to, is there could be some strikes, precision strikes against cartels that he spins to great effect at home, and that Scheinbaum messages the way that she started to message, which is that this was not a violation of Mexican sovereignty, even if it was. That this was done in coordination, and actually is able to use that to bolster her own domestic standing. There's been some interesting polling that's come out recently showing that a fair number of Mexicans are not opposed to an increased military role for the United States in combating the cartels. I mean, this is quite a crisis in Mexico. It's not like transnational organized crime is terribly popular per se in Mexico. As Ricardo has alluded to on a number of occasions, she's a very savvy politician. So I guess my base case is that somehow they work it out between the two of them, where that type of a scenario that you just outlined never comes to fruition because it's not necessary. They've both taken care of their political goals with something that falls short.
Very good. Fernanda, would you like to add something to that conversation?
Yes, I agree with both of them. And I think that Trump does not operate by traditional diplomatic protocols. So he's not just a businessman, and people are used to say, but he's also a political animal. So he's willing to defend those who are loyal to him and his points, regardless of borders. So I do believe it's quite likely that he will advance on leaders of other countries. And I would not ignore the possibility of conventional interventionist approach by force. I don't see boots on the ground all over, but I do see specific strategies for specific regions. For example, he tried to suggest something not very clearly about Gaza, for example, and then the response was very bad in the US. So he decided to go back and say, no, it was not what I said. It was not sending our forces to Gaza. It was a different approach. But my feeling is that he's testing the limits. And if he finds a subject, an issue in which he does have the approval of public opinion or even the Congress, in specific case, it would be feasible, such as the Panama Canal, for example. I would not disconsider this possibility, but I do believe that it would be very specific. In general approach, I think he relies on economic power to exercise coercion. He believes that the economic power is the most important tool that he can use, and it's what we're all seeing. It's very interesting that today, during the first cabinet meeting, he announced tariffs of 25% to Europe. And it's quite interesting to say that for China, it was 10% till this moment. So his, punishing the allies in more than a double of tariffs than it was done to the Chinese, that are considered historically and even for his government as the most important adversary of the US. So this balance is really interesting to see. So he's not making divisions between who is with the US and who is against the US in terms of values or in terms of shared visions. The approach is it's an approach that in Portuguese we would say that is a very similar to accounting approach. Yeah, he's looking to the relationship as a zero-sum game, all of them, and there is always a winner and a loser, and the US is not the one who is going to be the loser. So whatever and whoever is in the way to put the US in a bad position, as the way he frames it, it will be considered someone who must and should be, counterbalanced. I think that's why he is very willing to interfere in the rhetoric or in the very conventional ways in different parts of the world.
In your initial remarks, Ricardo, you said Trump has three subjects, three themes, which are crucial to him, through which he sees the region, right? Immigration, combating organized crime, and curbing China's influence in Latin America. Let me focus on this third item. Brazil has gets a lot of investment from China, exports a lot to China. To what extent that can be a problem from the perspective of the US? Let me turn to an example. The 5G decision that was taken by Brazil when Trump was in the White House in the first term. We had enough room of maneuver to find a sort of middle of the way solution and accepting Hawaii as a participant in the 5G in Brazil. And there was no major retaliation from the US in those days. Do you think if something similar happens today, the reaction of the US would be dramatically different?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think that for one thing, these are now sort of more extensively held positions, and his national security advisor, Mike Waltz, came in with a very strong sort of anti-China posture. That's one area where there's a lot of bipartisan support, and so I do think that since they put combating China at the center of policy, that I think that there would be. But Nick is right too about the kind of the BRICS component being a factor there. Like things have changed, And I mean, Fernando's point about this being a zero-sum game is absolutely the case. So I think the way to look at it is the way that the White House is going to look at this is, so you say you want to partner with me. If your major partner is China in any aspect, then you've sided with them. He's not a sort of traditional diplomat. He's not a traditional person, and the person who looks at economics traditionally either, who sees imbalances in trade as as aggressive, as acts of as theft almost. And so, yes, you certainly see that teed up. I will say this: almost everything is negotiable. So, for instance, I'll just put the issue of Taiwan on the table here as well. Clearly, the defense of Taiwan has been a core U.S. foreign policy position for now almost for 60, 70 years at this stage, and for President Trump, that's not an important issue. He is anti-China, not pro-Taiwan. From his perspective, Taiwan is, as he has called it, an economic enemy. So he's willing to impose additional tariffs on semiconductors for U.S. industry if there is not more domestic production in the United States of semiconductors. And there's some speculation that he would be perfectly comfortable with giving up Taiwan if it accommodated China in some way that was important for U.S. trade balances, for instance. So everything is in play, and no one is particularly safe in their old alliances. And I think that's the key. That's the key element.
Ricardo, let me comment. I'll get to you in a minute, Nick. Let me comment on that because, as far as I know, I'm not an expert on this issue. But for instance, if you envisage a scenario in which China takes Taiwan and suspend the flow of semiconductors to the rest of the world in general and the U.S. in particular, with all the incentives of industrial policy in place, it will take a long, long time for the U.S. to become self-sufficient in terms of the supply of semiconductors. So do you think that the economic consequences of their geopolitical actions and preferences is something that they do factor in or they don't?
Depends on who you mean by they. I do think that most of his advisors are quite clear. Secretary Rubio, his national security advisor, completely understand the risks involved. President Trump may not, or he may see this as something that could be solved as part of the game. And he is a political animal. Fernando's absolutely right. That does not translate into kind of a deep understanding of how these systems work. Whereas the team surrounding him, including the Secretary of Commerce, understand very, very well that we're not in a position to see Taiwan fall under Chinese control from the perspective of the United States. And not just the United States, the rest of the world. I think that's the point. Having that much production of semiconductors in the hands of any single power at this stage is inherently destabilizing and problematic for everyone involved. And this is a live issue. This is not like a notional consideration. This is something that really has to be a part of the debate. And I think what you would hear from the White House is, well, we understand this perfectly. This is all part of gamesmanship. He's an ultimate negotiator. But China has learned how to deal with President Trump as well. And so they're making their own calculations based on how this might play out.
Good. Nick, you were about to say something when I abruptly interrupt you. So back to you. No?
I wasn't, Sergio. No.
No, I have a question for you and Fernanda, because you said Brazil. It seems to me that you're more pessimistic than optimistic when it comes to the next 2 years of U.S.-Brazil relations, because as far as I understand you see political incentives on both sides to engage in sort of politically polarized, toxic relationship. I want you to elaborate a little bit more on that. And then, Fernanda, you said you had comments about Brazil-U.S. relations. So after Nick, please do your comments. Make your comments. Nick.
Sure. That's essentially correct, Sergio. I see more risk than opportunities, but as you mentioned earlier, none of us has a crystal ball If incentivized, I think that the Lula administration could ramp up overtures on public security matters, transnational organized crime, deepen cooperation on migration, perhaps de-emphasize de-dollarization, at least rhetorically, and try to make overtures to the Trump world that it is doing all of these things, engaging in some self-marketing, and perhaps a pragmatic relationship can be maintained. I do not discard that possibility. Others that are speaking, like Fernanda and yourself, as well as our audience, know Lula's politics better than I do. I think that that's a complicated play for him. And how far he's willing to go to accommodate this transactional and sometimes punitive approach that Trump adopts in foreign policy, I think is an open question. And so if he doesn't pursue that, if that's not his orientation, then I think that between the linkages via organizations like CPAC, between the Brazilian conservative movement, concerns that the US technology sector has about regulation in Brazil, the influence that some of those companies have in the current Trump administration, that you could see a collision, particularly around the 2026 election. And, we just saw today the State Department make some statements about the need to respect sovereignty goes both ways with respect to blocking the Rumble social media platform in Brazil for alleged violations of Brazilian law. This space makes me nervous in terms of the trajectory of the bilateral relationship. And I do not think it's impossible. In fact, I would say it's probably likely that President Trump and his advisors, when a clear opposition candidate emerges to President Lula in 2026, will endorse said candidate. And at that point, it would be understandable for the Lula administration to perhaps not pursue pragmatic cooperation at any and all costs. And so that's what I mean by a bit of a toxic self-fulfilling prophecy, where each action engenders a counter reaction that leads to something of a souring in the relationship. And then, depending on what happens in Brazil in 2026 and the United States in 2028 and beyond, we'll have to take stock anew.
Fernanda, your comments on that?
Yes, I would like just to add something to what Ricardo said about the Taiwan and China relationship. I think it's important to understand in this specific framework of understanding that this is partly the reason that the US is trying to somehow negotiate at this point some agreements with Ukraine or even Russia in terms of supplies of critical minerals. Sometimes people don't understand very well why it is happening right now and why the US would condition the approach of the ending war in the Eastern Europe at this subject. But critical minerals such as lithium, cobalt, and rare earths, they are very important to US supply chain and supply chains, and it can help to reduce dependence on countries like China. So to boost energy, technology, security, it is very important. So the US they have plans to deal with that. Going back to Brazil, there is a very famous song here in Brazil, Sergio, you know that song, that says that anything can happen, including nothing. And it's something that applies to the bilateral relations. So many of the diplomats I've been talking to here in Brazil, they have this perception that we are very close to a crisis, but sometimes the crisis can never really happen. I would like to be as optimistic as my friends diplomats that imagine that nothing will happen. In my perspective, clashes with the Lula government are inevitable. I think they will happen, especially with the approaching of the 2026 elections. And just to give like one example by reason, I think the clashes are inevitable because first, we have as countries very different strategic priorities. This is the first one. Secondly, we have some pragmatic agendas that are not compatible. And third, we have ideological agendas that maybe can generate clashes as well. So to give just one example by each of these three fronts, I would say that in the strategic priorities, BRICS are the number one, as Nick just mentioned. So the US is very careful about what is the meaning of this platform, what's going to be this meeting, what's the role of China in the BRICS, what's the discussion over de-dollarization. And this is, the perfect storm for diplomatic crisis between the two countries. So in terms of strategic priorities, the US is trying to rebuild the Gilded Age in which the US is the hegemony that is not under contestation. And Brazil is one of the 5 countries willing to build the new multipolar world. So this is the first problem that we face. In terms of pragmatic agendas, till the other day, the Brazilians were very comfortable with the idea that we don't have a deficit in the commercial / trade agenda with the US. The US, they don't have a deficit with us, actually. So the idea was that we are safe because they are just targeting people with whom they have deficits. So, China is a problem, Mexico is a problem, Brazil is safe. And now what seems to be is that Trump is going deeper in this strategy. So it doesn't matter the general balance. It's also a matter of, sectorial approach and sometimes even project by project approach. So it doesn't matter if the Brazilian trade balance in general is super arbitrary. If, for example, the ethanol is under taxation of 18% by the Brazilians, and the American ethanol is under 2% of taxes. So they want to discuss that. So we're not safe. We're going to face the tariffs, the trades, and the negotiations that will not be just steel, aluminum. It's going to be over lots of other sectors that affects Brazil. And in the ideological agenda, of course, the influence of Elon Musk, the approach of this big tech company, the big tech companies, and the relationship involving the Supreme Court of Brazil, STF, is something that is already happening. So it's impossible to ignore the fact that Eduardo Bolsonaro himself was part of the lobbying process that went to the US and had meetings with very different actors in the Congress. And, these political actors, ideologically oriented, they are traveling, they are connected, they are sharing ideas, and it will come as an institutional policy at some point. So it's impossible not to consider the consequences of that. And to conclude, I would say that, the clashes are inevitable because of all these very contrary positions between Trump's government and Lula's government, but also because the communication channels are very limited at this moment. It's very desperate, to say the least, when you talk to the diplomats here in Brazil, people from the career, very experienced diplomats. They are very careful in talking about the bilateral relations, and they also are very careful in saying that the professional diplomats, they are not being able of engage to the new administration in the high level. They have difficulties to penetrate, to build trust. And so if Brazil, what I've been hearing a lot by different actors is that if Brazil and the US, they face a crisis, a diplomatic crisis, we will have problems to make ourselves heard as a priority. We are in the end of the list to those in Washington would be received and will have a chance to make her point. So that's why the song says anything can happen, including nothing. But I personally, that a lot will happen.
We are approaching the end of our conversation, but I want to, before I ask you the simple question of what would be your advice to Brazilian authorities on how best to deal with Trump and the U.S. under President Trump, I would like to mention the fact that graphically shows how politicized the media regulation subject is in Brazil. I think last week, the Liberal Party, Partido Liberal, which is the party of Bolsonaro, convened a meeting in Brasilia, and sort of the motto of the meeting was the largest party in Brazil with the largest technological companies in the world. And the big techs sent their representatives to the meeting. It was a public meeting with militants, with parliamentarians, with party leaders. And the idea was a sort of united front between the Liberal Party and the big techs against censorship in favor of freedom of expression, that kind of thing. So I think this is one more piece of information that shows that confrontation is more likely than not. But let me explore a different scenario. Ricardo, you mentioned that you have people who are more, for lack of a better word, more reasonable in the administration. They might think through it strategically and come to the conclusion that it wouldn't be in the long-term interest of the U.S. to confront Brazil because that would lead Brazil to get closer to China, right? So in that, this is a reason that might intervene in order to avoid the Trump to interfere directly in Brazilian domestic politics. Do you think this is as a plausible scenario, at least?
Yes,
a sort
absolutely.
Of self-constrained, it sounds ridiculous, right? It's a self-constrained Trump that think, yeah, let's not interfere there because this will lead them closer to China.
Look, Brazil and the United States both have a real shared interest. For instance, just to take that point of critical minerals, Brazil, as I think the third largest reservoir of rare earths in the world, and the massive critical minerals in its possession, and the United States needs access to those for its own industrial process. Brazil needs to be a part of a value-added industrial process to make use of those resources. It's one of the lowest producers of rare earths, for instance, in the world, and one of the largest reservoirs of rare earths. So you see, like, there is a combination of interest there. So what Brazil and the Brazilian government could do, I would say, is take advantage of the fact that the U.S. is in a moment where it doesn't care about free trade agreements or, frankly, the arrangements that it had previously with other governments. It wants deals today under its terms. And mutually beneficial is not important to this administration, but it doesn't have to be for it to be beneficial to Brazil. So that I would absolutely, and not just on this, but in other sectors as well, say, okay, we don't need a free trade agreement with the United States. We're going to have these sectoral arrangements, and it's going to be a trade. It's going to be a negotiation. On Fernando's point about ethanol, that's absolutely correct. But now I want access to another element, right? For instance, I want to be removed from the tariffs on steel. in exchange for a deal. This is the ultimate deal-making administration. So having that passed, it really doesn't matter. You can cut a deal today. So in that sense, there's an advantage to being under the in the current circumstances. What was impossible yesterday is absolutely possible with this administration, and that can be both negative and positive for a government that's willing to meet this government on its own terms.
To close this very interesting conversation, 2 minutes each, what would be your advice for Brazilian authorities, especially federal government, to deal with Trump? Nick, you go first, and Ricardo and Fernanda ends.
I will conclude by picking up where I sort of ended my initial remarks. The world is becoming more multipolar, and modern Brazil, both throughout the democratization, but even before, has always identified trying to play other big powers and emerging powers off of each other to advance a truly Brazilian national interest. I think the best way forward is to hold on to that idea while understanding that the circumstances through which a new multipolar order are being created are perhaps different than what Itamaraty had in the abstract in its policy planning shops envisioned. And so what I mean by that is the ideological differences notwithstanding, it is very much in this Brazilian government's interest to find ways to cooperate with Trump's America, notwithstanding some of the economic and geopolitical synergies that the Lula administration has identified in its relationship with Beijing and the BRICS Plus. And so I would endeavor through critical minerals, as Fernanda and Ricardo have just highlighted, I would find pathways to facilitate cooperation and U.S. investment in critical minerals in Brazil, something we haven't really seen from the Lula administration thus far, including when it was the Biden administration in office. I would look to ramp up on another shared interest, transnational organized crime. I think the reach of the PCC is and those organizations that it interacts with in other parts of the Americas and Europe is a clear synergy. I would endeavor to find ways to advance Brazilian interest, irrespective of ideology, with both Beijing and Trump's White House. That is what I would do. I think that would offset the worst and be the best case scenario for Brazil's interest in taking a little bit of the polarization out of the relationship, which, as everyone here who has spoken has highlighted, is of, at least in certain areas, strategic benefit, and very much so to both countries. Thank you again for the invite, Serge.
Thank you. Ricardo.
Well, look, I'm not going to repeat. I fully support everything Nick just said. I would just say, one, be practical. Two, do an inventory of what your actual interests are with the United States, borrowing from Nick's list and adding on as necessary. And three, I would just say also be practical about the direction of the geopolitical order. It is not the one that was imagined, as I think we've covered earlier. It is not one where the BRICS are automatically ascendant. In a world where the United States is not in accord with many of its G7 partners. What good is a BRICS that's poised against the G7 when the G7 is no longer united itself? Be practical in this as well. And I would just say, lastly, I will close on a quote from our colleague Juan Cruz, which is, "The impossible is now possible." In this administration. And so use your imaginations, Anita Marachi, about what the world might look like a year from now. Thank you very much for this opportunity to be here.
Fernanda.
So I'll try to sum up in 5 points. The first one, be sure to diversify partners, because diversifying is also diversifying risks. That's hedging. So Brazil kept going with the diversifying strategy. But when it comes to the US, I would say be transactional as they are. Focus on common agendas. I would mention, as Dick said, supply chain, energy, security. So it's possible to build up under these specific agendas. Avoid shocks on sensitive topics. And last but not least, when it comes to clashing, do it in a group, not alone.
Very good. Very good. I knew that would be very interesting because you are wonderful analysts as well as very, very good friends. It's been a pleasure. Nick, Ricardo, Fernanda, I hope we can see each other soon, either here or there, get together and exchange ideas and hugs.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Hugs are
Thank you,
always
Sergio.
welcome.
It was a
It's
great
really
pleasure.
Okay, take care. Bye bye. Obrigado a todos e todas.
Obrigado a nós.